Great. So it's about time. Thanks for joining today. This is our third session, We Champion Speaker Series session. I'm Radhika Iyengar. I'm at the Center for Sustainable Development, focusing on SDG 4.7 that discusses education for sustainable development and global citizenship education. And we also partner with many of our Columbia networks. Sandra and I are part of the disaster risk mitigation network, as well as we also partner with as part of Mission 4.7, we also partner with Ban Ki-moon Center, UNESCO, SDSN, which is Sustainable Development Solutions Network. So this series, We Champion series, is a part of Mission 4.7 series, trying to bring in researchers, practitioners, climate activists, all different genre of people who are who are champions in this area. Here we are talking to Sandra today, but before that, I'll hand over to Hope, who will be moderating the discussion for today. Hope is a climate school student and has completed her papers and is on her way to become a graduate of the climate school. So congratulations, Hope, big achievement. And over to you for the moderation for today.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'm a little bit ill, so please excuse me if my voice is a bit husky. So I'm going to be talking with Sandra today a little bit about her research. Sandra, it's lovely to have you. Thank you for making the time. And as Radhika mentioned, I'm just finishing up a master's at the climate school right now, and one of my interests is sustainable development. Another of my interests is strategic communications, which is why I'm involved with this work. So without further ado, I'm just going to jump in and start asking Sandra some questions about herself and her work. So Sandra currently serves as the co-investigator on the Geo-Referenced infrastructure and demographic data for development, which is long. So it's also called Grid 3, the Grid 3 program. And Sandra, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that project. So where has it been active and what are its aims?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for the invitation, for the opportunity to talk to you all. So I'll start with the aims. Grid 3 brings together several different organizations that have expertise in geospatial data to support countries to expand and strengthen their geographic information systems. And this is done to inform policy, inform decision-making, and practice. And this is for all kinds of sectors and spheres. And by doing this, we aim to make development interventions more efficient and effective. We contribute to capacity strengthening through technical assistance and training. And the spatial data solutions that we design are based on each country's capacity and development needs. So today we're going to be focusing on, our focus is on planning for and improving service delivery in the education and health sectors, but there are many other possible applications of the Grid 3 products. So for example, just quickly, disaster risk management, which was something that Radhika had just mentioned, financial services could be another area. In the health sector, most recently, we've been doing a lot of work to support, to create maps to support micro-planning for routine and non-routine vaccine campaigns for COVID-19, for measles, and others. And there's also been work done to create maps to support malaria control. We talk, in Grid 3, we talk about a core set of geospatial data layers that we help countries generate and use. So I'm just going to quickly go through those. There's high resolution population distribution data, settlement locations, which includes settlement extents and settlement points with place names, subnational boundaries, which includes administrative boundaries, things like school catchment areas, health areas, and then the last one, infrastructure layers or points of interest. And so this includes things like schools and health facilities. And it's important to stress that we promote open data So in other words, publicly accessible data. And in terms of where we're active, so far we've been active in countries in Africa. The program started in Nigeria, building on previous work that had been done, funded by the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation. So this was, Grid 3 started in the fall of 2017. So building on previous work in Nigeria and then expanding to other countries, including Zambia, DRC, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, South Sudan, Burkina Faso, Niger, Kenya, and Mali. So these are countries where we're quite active. And then it's important also to explain that we're active at varying degrees in different countries. So there's one of our products, the Settlement Extents product, we actually have already produced for all of sub-Saharan Africa. But then those other countries that I listed previously, there are many additional data sets. And so what you can do is, I think Radhika shared a link here in the chat. Yeah, exactly. So if you go to the grid3.org site, you'll be able to navigate to something called the Grid 3 Data Hub. And there's a how-to video that you can watch, and you can then go and use this interactive platform to click on specific countries to see exactly which data sets are available for each country. And I just want to mention who our core partners are in this project. So I'm at CIESIN, the Center for International Earth Science Information Network, which is part of the Columbia Climate School on the Lamont campus. The other core partners are WorldPop at the University of Southampton in the UK, FlowMinder, and UNFPA, the UN Population Fund. And as I mentioned before, our funding is from the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation and UK Aid, FCDO.
Thank you for that overview. That's brilliant. It's incredible how much you've put together, especially because there are certainly data challenges in the areas of the world that you work in sub-Saharan Africa. And I'd love to talk a little bit about that. So I've read things about Grid 3, which talk about how there's a lack of accessible, usable, and compatible geospatial data sometimes, and that can make it hard to make progress on health issues. So, and also, of course, other sustainable development goals. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some country-specific challenges in data collection in your experience.
Yeah, so one very big challenge, and this is true for many countries, is achieving a comprehensive countrywide spatial coverage. Of course, you know, there's high cost monetarily, there's the challenge of staffing that kind of effort. In some countries, you may have difficulty accessing parts of the country due to conflict or the impacts of a disaster, things like this. So this is one of the reasons why data derived from satellite imagery is so critical, to combine the data derived from satellite imagery with data collected in other ways from other sources like censuses and surveys. So, you know, field-based data collection. So satellite imagery, those core data layers that I mentioned earlier, satellite imagery is incorporated in the production of all those layers to some extent. One where it's very closely tied to the satellite imagery are the settlement extents, those polygons that are derived from building footprints. So these building footprints are agglomerated, and these agglomerations are classified into 3 categories: built up areas, which are the largest urban agglomerations, small settlement areas, which are smaller urban areas, and hamlets. In addition to the countrywide spatial coverage challenge, I'd say another very big challenge is maintaining adequate frequency of data collection so that these data sets are up to date and timely. As I mentioned before, there's the issue of population displacements for different reasons. And this is when we talk about like country-specific challenges. In the case of Mozambique, this is a challenge that we're currently facing. There have been cyclones in recent years that have displaced populations in Mozambique, also conflict in the northern region that has displaced significant populations. So yeah, this is another big challenge. One thing in terms of opportunities, like the flip side, we're sometimes able to consolidate existing data sets to create a more complete version. And this has happened in certain countries in developing a health facilities list where the country did not have a complete version, but by pulling from some existing versions for different parts of the country, for the DRC, for example, they were able to create a new product, a new health facility list that was more comprehensive, more complete. And then another opportunity too is to integrate GIS with field operations and to train field staff to use, for example, smartphone applications to collect data that can then easily be integrated into the GIS.
So earlier you mentioned that Grid 3 at the moment is supporting micro-planning for vaccine campaigns. Is the strategy you just mentioned with the smartphones and field operatives part of that?
Yes, yeah. So this is happening, and they're trying different applications, different tools. Yes, this is being tested.
That's really interesting. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how this looks in an education context. So you've talked a little bit about how it's working currently for health, but can you talk a little bit about any geospatial data for schools specifically?
Yeah, and I can give a couple of examples. So Grid 3 has worked on this on conducting school coverage assessments in both Nigeria, first in Nigeria, and then more recently in Sierra Leone. And Grid, so the part of the Grid 3 team has also been working on developing optimization tools to help cite new schools. So we look at access to education, which can be evaluated by measuring the distance between schools and school-age populations. And we can also look at things like education quality by analyzing, for example, the student-to-teacher ratios in order to try to help plan existing, the expansion of existing schools. So there's more detail about this. I can share, I thought I might share a couple of links for more detail about this. I can put these in the chat. I'll put one link. Here's one for Nigeria, for the work that we've done in Nigeria. And then I'll also share a news item that we have about the work in Sierra Leone.
Thank you for those. I think that's really interesting. So I'm also, I guess, thinking more broadly about how this can be used for promoting SDG 4, which is quality education for all. And you've spoken a little bit about that when you were talking about student to teacher ratios, better understanding that, understanding the distance between school and school-age populations. But I wondered if there's anything else you would like to add.
Yeah, so for those who may not be that familiar with GIS and geospatial mapping, what I want to stress is that it allows a very high level of detail that can allow for better planning of interventions, better targeting these interventions. So it provides teams, from different stakeholders, the different organizations that make up Grid 3 to have an environment where you can, overlay and analyze all of these different data sets and together interpret the results, discuss, investigate further. Are there remaining questions that haven't been answered? Are there new questions that arise through this process? So it just really creates that kind of working environment to figure out what the data gaps are and to, communicate if there are certain results that you can be confident of, communicate that to a community and provide visualizations that support that. I also wanted to mention how sometimes education can intersect with health concerns. So in school inventories, often there will be data, water, sanitation, and hygiene, for example, related questions. So you'll have information about things like running water. Is there running water in the school? Is there potable water there? Are there toilets in the school? the conditions of the school, these kinds of characteristics about the schools. There's other things like, whether or not the school has electricity. So you can use geospatial mapping with so much rich information. You can actually present them and visualize them and analyze them spatially to, hone in and target what kinds of interventions are needed and where resources, should be allocated.
So you mentioned stakeholders just now, and I think this is a really interesting point. And I'd love to talk a little bit about co-producing knowledge with local stakeholders. So why do you think it's important to do this? And what are some challenges in doing co-production properly?
Yeah, I really think this is an incredibly important question. I'm glad you included this. So it is so incredibly essential in our work to co-produce knowledge with local and national stakeholders. And that, includes, and it starts with, I think, knowledge sharing and building understanding and trust. And that takes time, and that can be challenging when we have people in New York, UK, and, various other countries in Africa, and trying to, when we first started in 2017, 2018, 2019, before March 2020, it was, so easy to, well, it wasn't so easy, but, relatively, we were doing a lot of travel. We were going and carrying out, there would be teams from the different Grid 3 core partners visiting the countries and meeting with the different key stakeholders, in government agencies, UN partners at UN agencies. And then that became a lot more challenging, after the pandemic hit. But it's so important to work together with the stakeholders to clearly assess and prioritize data needs, to create effective teams and develop effective workflows. And that really requires, I think, regular and frequent communication, and also we use a lot of different modes of communication. So a combination of virtual and in person. And as I said, we've been somewhat limited to virtual meetings and exchanges during the pandemic, but now that's changing. And for example, this week we have a Grid 3 GIS training event that's taking place in Sierra Leone for partners in Ministry of Health, Ministry of Basic and Senior Secondary Education, and their national statistics organization. So the face-to-face meetings and interactions are starting to happen again more frequently, and they're extremely important. And we often organize, these kinds of workshops to bring the different key stakeholders together for discussions and development of spatial data solutions. And it's often, sometimes we're bringing together different agencies that weren't necessarily meeting very much before. So I think GRID does play an important role in bringing different stakeholders together.
I love that. I love that you play a role in sort of bridging divides between different people in your work. I'm aware that we want to leave a little bit of time for questions, so I'm going to raise one more point for discussion, and then I'm going to turn it over to any questions people may have. But this one is close to my heart. So as I mentioned, I'm just finishing up a master's at the Climate School at the moment. And at the Climate School, we talk a lot about how to ensure that the climate data we create is accessible and credible and relevant to end users. Because of course we want to create quality data, but if it's outputted in the form that scientists think is the most accurate, it's not always easy for users to understand, process, and implement it. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how we can ensure that people are able to use the data that we create, and that you specifically create with Grid 3.
Yeah, so we've been trying to ensure that the kinds of web interfaces that we develop are as user-friendly as possible. And it's sort of tiered for different types of users. So there are elements that are interactive, that for the lay person can explore the data and visualize the data without having to have the expertise of a GIS specialist. They don't necessarily need to download the data set and put it into GIS, right? They can just explore it through the web browser. and even create like the PDFs or, images of the maps that they can create. So this could be useful for, educators and students and practitioners and, all kinds of different users. So we do try to ensure that our data sets are as accessible to the public as possible, and that they're, widely disseminated. We disseminate through different channels. So, the data that's disseminated on the GRID3 website can also be disseminated through the open data platform of institutions in, the countries, different institutions in the country that would like to also, put that on their platform and make it available. Sometimes it needs to be translated, that interface needs to be translated to the official language of the country. So that also expands the audience that it reaches. But yeah, I think it's important that we communicate in multiple ways and through multiple channels. And it's not just limited to the digital, channel. We can also, and we do also print maps and distribute these locally. So there's, it's important that we reach partners and communities that don't necessarily have internet access, maybe not easily, accessible, or maybe not at all. So the paper maps can play an extremely important role for communication, for two-way communication, so that there can be feedback on those paper maps too, that can then, validate or help to find things that need to be improved in the GIS, that maybe there are some problems that need to be addressed, or something that's missing. So we've done things like create a webinar series. So there's some very accessible videos that people can watch that they can access from our website. And then this health facilities mapping paper, is one of a series of papers. So there's also some other papers that folks might want to take a look at they can download from the website. And then I do encourage folks to take a look at that how-to tutorial on how to use the GRID3 Data Hub to visualize, explore, and download data, and experiment with that.
Thank you very much for that. And it's been a fantastic overview of the project, where it's working, what its aims are, some of the considerations it has to do with stakeholders. And unless, Radhika, you would prefer that we talk for a little longer, I wonder if now is a good time to open it up for questions.
Sounds great, Hope. Yeah, if there are questions from our participants. And thank you for sharing the link, Sandra. I think we will all get time to digest all of them, read it carefully. I've also shared it on our Twitter handle.
And there are other news stories. So I just shared 2 links to 2 news stories, but there are dozens of news stories. So you can kind of scroll through and see what is of interest. And we also have a newsletter, a quarterly newsletter, if folks would like to sign up for that. And there are instructions on how to subscribe on the website under the, if you go to newsletters in the menu.
Fantastic. So I wonder if anyone who's listening right now has any questions based on what Sandra has discussed. Just give people a minute and feel free to raise your hand or just start speaking.
Meanwhile, I have a question, Sandra, if you can maybe just throw some light on how updatable these maps are, and how, because sometimes data changes, and then some maps I get working at the district that are 10 years old, they were printed. So how do you deal with data updates, and how do you know that in Sierra Leone there's this new data set that has come up, and working with the ministry? So any strategies on updating the maps and data sets that you have?
Yeah, so it really varies. It's kind of on a country by country basis. So just to give an example, because there are so many different examples, but one of my roles is to manage the GRID3 activities in Mozambique. And for example, there we released a couple of years ago the gridded population estimates. So these are produced by our partner WorldPop and in collaboration with the Mozambican key stakeholders, specifically the National Institute of Health. And this was based on, they do something, you can learn more about this on the website, but WorldPop has two different approaches to modeling the gridded population layer. One is the top-down approach, which is the one they used in Mozambique. And in the top-down approach, they have a full census that can then be integrated with other inputs, including inputs from satellite imagery, to produce a surface, a population distribution surface. So this was done with district level data for Mozambique that's openly available, publicly available on the Mozambique website, but using 2017 census data. And so now we're, because even just a few years later, and because of the things like the population displacement that I mentioned earlier, we're talking about, how to create the next version just a couple of years later, using projections, and then also figuring out a methodology to take into account these population displacements. So it gets very, like I said before, the data solutions, spatial data solutions that we come up with are very country specific, and it just, there's a recognition by the users. We get feedback from users on, for example, in the case of Mozambique, the data set that's available was used for, or was at least explored to be used for malaria control. And in the end, another data source from a more recent year, from 2019, was used in that MDA campaign, because they found that the numbers were more accurate. So, that kind of feedback it makes us realize, okay, we really do need to figure out how we're going to create the next version of the data set that, that has countrywide coverage, and try to brainstorm on how best to do that, and how to do that in partnership with the key stakeholders.
Thank you, Sandra. I think your answer was very reassuring, that you get feedback from the users and they tell you what to do and to bring in all the key stakeholders. So I like the messiness part of like getting everyone involved and seeing where we want to go together, which is, I think, the beauty about what your project is doing. It's wonderful to hear.
I'll share my email in the chat in case folks would like to reach out.
I have one question just based on what you were speaking about. So a little while ago, you spoke about giving smartphones to field operatives. And I was wondering if there is something that's sort of analogous which educators could use to collect data. So are there any ways which educators could be collecting geospatial data?
I mean, I think there actually are some opportunities, some crowdsourcing opportunities where the public can participate, sort of citizen science kind of opportunities. I'd have to do a little investigation, and depending on the country, but there are, I think, more and more those types of opportunities where you can do that with your smartphone, or or when you're home at your computer at home. But contribute to those kinds of efforts, and that's something that educators could guide, could learn more about and guide their students to participate in. I do think there's like a good space to use the Grid 3 resources to develop. There's a to like curate educational resources and develop a curriculum, or develop curricula for different levels. I think it's the way it is right now, it's somewhat accessible to the secondary level, certainly to university level, but it would be, a bit harder for primary, there's some things that I think could be adapted for primary level education, but it might be a bit more challenging. But I don't know, maybe I'm just out of touch. Maybe it is actually quite accessible to a lot of primary school students. They're more advanced than I was at that age.
They're certainly more advanced than I was at that age. I feel like I know a lot of fairly young children who know their way around a smartphone at least as well as I do.
Yeah, exactly.
I just had one last question, I guess. So my last question is how the use of geospatial data can help. You talked a little bit about feedback before, about your users giving feedback. And I wonder how the monitoring and evaluation process happens for all of this.
Yeah, so that's something that's been ongoing, using the MEL framework, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So we do have folks on the team that focus on that and coordinating that, and are currently working on, interviews with the user community to produce a report of their findings. But what I think is important to say is that, the spatial data approach allows us to monitor metrics at very local scale, at more localized scales. So, we can track to at these very local scales, whether there's been, if you have certain indicators that you can track, whether there's been improvements or if we've failed to improve over time. So I think that the ability to do this finer scale monitoring and analysis is very important. And so, reporting on that through these news stories and through other kinds of documentation so that we can, improve as we move forward. But it is one way that we can identify areas that have been maybe underserviced or missed, and that should be targeted in future interventions.
Great, I think we are up to the hour, a little bit over. Thank you so much, Hope and Sandra, for doing this discussion. And Sandra, we really appreciate you taking a different level in terms of the data and focusing on policy level work and planning and stakeholder partnerships. So that was fantastic. And thanks, Hope, for your wonderful questions. I think they addressed a lot of our questions here. There are resources that Sandra has put in the chat. We've also retweeted it, as well as her email ID. If you would like to get in touch with her, that would be great. And I want to thank everyone who's joined today, and hope you carry at least some ideas on how data can inform your work in education planning as well as health planning from this discussion today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandra. Thanks, Hope.